Maslow in 10 Minutes. Of all of Abraham Maslow's ideas, many of which circulate around the themes of motivation and personality, his most famous is undoubtedly his hierarchy of needs, which appears in pretty much every introductory psychology textbook's description of humanistic psychology. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is almost always presented in the form of a triangle or pyramid, is the idea that human beings are first motivated to satisfy our basic physical needs, such as needs for food, shelter, and safety, and then our psychological needs, such as needs for a sense of belonging and esteem, and then finally what he calls self-actualization needs, which have to do with fulfilling the deepest possibilities inherent in our being. Maslow further divides self-actualization needs into two subcategories: Theory Z, which has to do with self-actualization that includes the presence of what he calls peak experiences or possibly plateau experiences, and Theory Y, which does not include such experiences. Basically, a peak experience is a brief, intense, often spiritual experience of ecstasy or oneness with God or the cosmos or unity with all of life. A plateau experience is like a peak experience, but not as intense and more long-lasting, more serene or contemplative, as he puts it. One of the upshots of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that all of our motivations point ultimately toward the fulfillment of our being, irrespective of whether we're inclined to have peak experiences or not. In this regard, Maslow's psychological ideas are highly ontological in flavor, a common theme within humanistic psychology more generally. This ontological predilection is also reflected in another basic distinction that Maslow draws between our different motivations. According to Maslow, many of our motivations are fueled by deficiencies in our lives. For instance, one motivation to succeed in the work world would be because one experiences a deficiency of money or material well-being in one's life. Maslow calls this kind of motivation a deficiency motivation, or demotivation for short. On the other hand, perhaps one's drive to succeed in the work world is fueled by a desire to fulfill the deepest possibilities of one's being. Maslow calls this kind of motivation, which basically maps onto self-actualization, a being motivation, or B-motivation. Maslow then extends the use of the prefixes D and B across many areas of our lives. For instance, we have D needs and B needs, that is, needs driven by deficiencies and needs driven by self-actualization. Similarly, we have D cognitions and B cognitions, D values and B values, and so on. But if all of our motivations are ultimately fueled by our movement toward fulfilling our being, then why do experiences where we're actually doing that seem so comparatively uncommon? Maslow explains this riddle in terms of what he calls the Jonah complex. Like the biblical Jonah, who famously turned away from God's commandment to prophesy the destruction of Nineveh, the capital of ancient Assyria, we too often turn away from fulfilling our deepest possibilities and destinies in life. As the poet Marianne Williamson famously put it, our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. The reasons for this are several. First, when we glimpse deep and powerful possibilities within ourselves, there comes along with that a weighty sense of responsibility for what we do or do not do with them. As Maslow puts it, what a man can be, he must be. So the Jonah complex is motivated in part by our desire to escape the sense of responsibility that comes with self-actualization. Beyond this, however, we're afraid of our deeper potentials because we're afraid of the social and interpersonal consequences of deep change. For most of us, the fear of being misunderstood and rejected is deep and primitive. But the reality of self-actualization is that it may call us beyond our already existing definitions and patterns of life, and perhaps so far out of life as we've known it, that our fear is that other people might not understand or accept us. Of course, if maintaining our friendships requires that we not live toward what's deepest and best in us, well, we might well wonder whether those people are really our friends at all. As Marianne Williamson again puts it, your playing small doesn't serve the world. There's nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. However, perhaps the deepest motivation behind the Jonah complex is that there's something irreducibly overwhelming about the experience of glimpsing the power inherent in our being. In other words, the Jonah complex is also about a fear of annihilation, a terror we feel about the possibility that life as we've known it might need to die so that some new, more powerful way of life can be born. In this regard, the Jonah complex is an expression of our fear of mortality, which in the final analysis is a fear of the reality of our own existence. In essence, we are what we fear and run from. Although Maslow's emphasis on self-actualization often prompts his critics to accuse him of formulating a kind of psychology that encourages self-preoccupation and social disconnection, it's important to note that Maslow emphasized that the self-actualizing subjects he studied were all deeply engaged in the affairs of the surrounding world. As he puts it in The Farther Reaches of Human Nature, perhaps his most famous work, self-actualizing people are, without a single exception, involved in a cause outside their own skin, in something outside of themselves. Basically, self-actualization involves a kind of selflessness. Furthermore, Maslow repeatedly notes that the self of self-actualization is not the egoistic sense of self at all, but the kind of self, or perhaps non-self, we have when we're completely immersed in the moment. Basically, the self of self-actualization is marked by the disappearance of our usual egoistic sense of self, not its aggrandizement. One area where all of this plays out is in the domain of creativity, which again is a fairly common topic within humanistic psychology. For Maslow, engaging in creative activity is one of the primary ways we have of moving towards self-actualization. It's also one of the more common places where peak experiences occur. Basically, Maslow divides creativity into two phases. First, there's the volcanic inspirational phase, which he calls primary creativeness. And then there's the relatively long, arduous phase that involves working out and refining that inspiration, a phase he calls secondary creativeness. Primary creativeness, which sometimes takes the form of a peak experience, is marked by qualities such as immersion in the moment, entering into trust and Taoistic receptivity, and finding oneself in a state of holistic integration with the world and with oneself. Consequently, Maslow stresses the importance of things like art education, where we can learn not merely more complex cognitive skills, but better ways of being alive. As he says in his discussion of education, to put it bluntly, we need a different kind of human being. And so, as is the case with most other humanistic psychologists, Maslow's thought also includes some measure of social critique. As we've seen, part of this plays out in his view of education. However, perhaps a more trenchant critique resides in his description of our era as desacralized, a kind of loss of the sense of the sacred and of the grandeur of life. For Maslow, desacralization is both a social historical tendency and a defense mechanism that has the undesirable side effect of lessening our chances to experience self-actualization. That's because our ability to see the sacred, the eternal, and the symbolic, as he puts it, actually fosters and enhances our opportunities to experience it. In this regard, Maslow draws a linkage between our capacity to see things holistically on one hand and self-actualization on the other. All in all, much of Maslow's thought circulates around the idea of acknowledging and fulfilling our human potential, and self-actualization is basically a way of characterizing it. In this regard, Maslow's work represents an attempt to expand the outer boundary of psychology so that it more easily encompasses life's positive, fulfilling experiences, in addition to the painful, pathological ones. However, for Maslow, even the idea of self-actualization doesn't provide a final destination for our lives. That's because the very act of actualizing our potential can't help but change us, which in turn naturally changes our potential too. So, in the final analysis, as with most other humanistic psychologists, Maslow's thought crystallizes in a view of life that is open-ended and that resists offering us any easy or final resting place. And that's Maslow in 10 minutes.